You are watching Top Hat Gaming, man. You win!
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Big Daddy Top Hat here. Over the course of the last year on this channel, we have looked at dozens and dozens of games from the beat 'em up genre. Amongst these fantastic titles, I have uploaded plenty of in-depth videos covering Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series, high quality beat 'em ups which took advantage of one of the most popular licenses of the late 80s and early 90s. The success of the Turtles would lead to all sorts of franchises that would take inspiration from the intellectual property, many of which had their own accompanying video games too. But when it comes to creating licenses inspired by the Turtles, no franchise in the world of video games at least did it with more style and substance than that of Battletoads. When we consider that we are just days away from a brand new Battletoads game seeing release, I felt that today would be as good a day as any to revisit the birth of this classic series. Whilst the source material for this game may be obvious, what is it about the original Battletoads title that makes it so memorable and still celebrated now? Within this content, we are going to be looking at every version of the first Battletoads adventure, look at what makes it so special and discuss why exactly this franchise is the greatest Turtles ripoff ever created. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Battletoads. Yeah! The year is 1991. We are 7 years into the lifespan of the Turtles brand. The comic book series arrived in 1984, the children's TV show in 1987, and the original arcade game in 1989. The game that delivered a groundbreaking 4-player cooperative experience meant that it was only a matter of time until the great game arrived in homes in some form. The most memorable of its conversions arrived on the NES in 1990. A version of the game that removed 4-player co-op and scaled back the graphics, but included a few new levels to help make up for the changes. Unsurprisingly, the game was one of the most popular titles released on 8-bit hardware that year, as children everywhere clamoured to own this cartridge. Konami had struck gold, and all most other developers could do was look on enviously at their success. One of the NES system's most prolific development houses, Rare, on the other hand, had their own ideas though, and considered an alternative way to make money off of the Turtles franchise on the hardware. Rare's relationship with the NES was an interesting one, and when people think about the company today, they are more likely to think of titles developed by the company for the Nintendo 64 or Super Nintendo, rather than Nintendo's earlier 8-bit system. And that is for good reason, to be fair. The British company Rare was founded originally under the name of Ultimate Play the Game, back in 1982, by brothers Tim and Chris Stamper. Ultimate Play the Game would develop some of the greatest games of the microcomputer era, releasing games on the ZX Spectrum such as Nightlaw, a groundbreaking isometric adventure, and the likes of Jetpack and Saberwolf, games which sold over 300,000 copies each across 1983 and 1984, in an era where American YouTubers alleged that people stopped buying video games altogether due to a crash. Not bad at all for two brothers from Leicestershire, eh? Now we all know how even more important Rare would become to gaming after their purchase of expensive Silicon graphics computers. But prior to all of this, the company was still achieving impressive feats in console gaming. In 1983, the brothers saw early on potential of the Famicom, and Chris would study the hardware for 6 months, ultimately managing to reverse engineer the system, a feat Nintendo thought was impossible. As a result, the brothers would fly to Kyoto to present their software samples to Nintendo executives. Nintendo was so impressed that they would purchase the Stamper's Slalom game, which would successfully sell 500,000 units in its own right. This meeting would end up in the brothers having the very first Western company to become a third-party Nintendo developer, meaning that in the Western world at least, the UK was leading in console game development, much like they had done in the world of microcomputers previously. Now we all know where this relationship would ultimately lead, but what about Rare games on the NES? When it comes to Rare games on the hardware, the company developed countless NES titles, resulting in varying degrees of quality. This was certainly an era for the company where they would place quantity over quality, making games for various publishers such as GameTek, Milton Bradley, Tradewest and LJN, just to name a few. the company would release gems like RC Pro AM in one moment, then be releasing tripe like Who Framed Roger Rabbit the next. Consistency in quality certainly did not seem to exist. Maybe different publishers expected different standards. Either way, there is no denying that Rare were comfortable in trying their hand at developing all sorts of games, so it is not that surprising really that the company would feel comfortable in developing a title attempting to cash in on Turtles' success. The Rare founders, Tim and Chris Stamper, like with the Famicom itself before, saw the potential of a well-made Turtles-like beat-em-up. This would mean that the brothers wanted to create a game based on the popular media franchise, but a game that would still be able to stand on its own 2 feet enough to stand out in its own right and be remembered as more than just a shameless clone. This would mean that the Battletoads title would include various elements and gameplay mechanics that were not included within the Turtles arcade game, all of which we'll discuss more on shortly. In many ways, a case could be made for the Battletoads being Rare's most ambitious endeavour yet, in that it was a franchise in which the company saw huge potential merchandising opportunities in the future to accompany their game. The game's designer, Greg Mayles, described the game as looking at what was popular at the time and then putting our own spin on it, kind of amping it up and making it a bit more edgy and a bit more violent. The game's artist, Kev Bayliss, mentions that the game's characters, Rash, Zit and Pimple, were all designed with the hope of having their own merchandising ranges in the future, sold on a mass scale like the Turtles that came before them. Bayliss also mentions that in the game's early stages of development, the title was known as Amphibians, spelt with a Z, and artistically wanted the game to look Disney-like in art style, but quickly realised that it would be too difficult, bearing in mind Disney's artists' skill level and budgets. Over time, the game would gradually become more violent and more gimmicks would be included to continue to help create a sense of uniqueness for the characters. For example, the Battletoads' ability to expand their hands in size and turn their feet into huge boots. This instantaneously made these fighters stand out over other playable characters in other games and cartoons. Music in the game was composed by David Wise, the legendary composer behind the soundtrack of Donkey Kong Country. Wise looked at Battletoads as a tongue-in-cheek version of the Turtles, but tongue-in-cheek or not, with him on board ensured that this game would have a good composition. The plot of Battletoads follows the 3 characters mentioned earlier, Rash, Zitz and Pimple, who, along with Professor T-Bird, are escorting Princess Angelica to her home planet using their spaceship known as the Vulture. Pimple and Angelica decide to take a leisurely trip in Pimple's flying car, but they get ambushed and captured by the Dark Queen. Aboard her ship, the Gargantua, Pimple sends a distress signal to the others, letting them know the ship is located beneath the surface of a nearby planet known as Ragnarok's world. From here, Professor T-Bird flies Rash and Zitz there in the Vulture to rescue them, setting off on a cooperative adventure through 12 diverse levels. In an earlier part of this video, I mentioned that mechanically this game varies greatly from the Turtles arcade game in terms of gameplay mechanics. Whilst this title is primarily a side-scrolling platforming beat-em-up at heart, the game also includes many varying gameplay elements, from racing to climbing to vehicle-based obstacle courses. This game mixes it up a lot. With the primary gameplay style being of a beat-em-up variety, many enemies can be defeated in this adventure through punching or kicking with an enlarged fist or boot, headbutting with huge ram horns, or in certain levels transforming into a wrecking ball. As mentioned by Kevin Bayliss earlier in the video, the Battletoads' ability to transform in this way is one of the Battletoads' most memorable and standout features. Like the Turtles beat-em-ups, most beat-em-up style stages in this game are presented in the now classic isometric perspective. The first stage, Ragnarok's Canyon, sees the Battletoad lowered to the surface down below. On this rocky terrain, the Toad, or Toads, take on axe-wielding pig-like foes and bipedal robot walkers. Interestingly, once these walkers have been pulverised, the Toads can innovatively use their legs as swingable weapons. There are multiple aerial enemies to take out too, some that can even be used as rideable steeds, much like in the Golden Axe game. Once players have finished traversing this stage, the first boss battle occurs. The threat is further emphasised by the sheer cartoon terror expressed by the Battletoads. The first fight is novel to say the least, as it occurs from a first-person perspective of the enemy, who shoots at the Toads through a virtual boy-like red viewpoint. The boss is defeatable by throwing rocks at it. Interestingly, whilst Battletoads is a game inspired by the Turtles, it seems that this boss encounter may have inspired the home port of Turtles in Time in the Future. It is certainly food for thought at least. There are cutscenes between stages showing the Dark Queen to continue to reaffirm players' goals. When the second stage is reached, gameplay is completely different to the previous level, as players traverse down a pit via a rope, taking on various aerial enemies and obstacles along the way, helping the game stand out further from all beat-em-ups that came before it. Stage 3 sees players arrive in what the game refers to as the Turbo Tunnel. There is some nice multi-layer background scrolling down here, and kangaroos to kill too. There are even some Space Invader inspired enemies to take out who give you restorative health items. These are a throwback to gaming's past, many years before it was even considered cool. The second part of this stage though is where things get really interesting, as the Battletoads ride flying jet bikes, avoiding multiple auto-scrolling obstacles. Like much of the game, this section is notoriously difficult and includes a very precise, very difficult gameplay. The overall difficulty in Battletoads was included in part because it was a short game, like many titles from the NES era, but the game is said to feature an additional layer of challenge due to the fact that the game's leading software developer was a really talented player, thus built the game's level of difficulty around his own skill level, meaning that many times within Battletoads, players must be precise to the 100th of the second when pressing the buttons on the controller. The Turbo Tunnel can therefore serve as a long, tough gauntlet for inexperienced players, which requires a lot of skill, reflexes and memorisation to get through, particularly the end section, which gets ridiculously fast paced. Stage 4, known as the Arctic Cavern, mixes up gameplay yet again, introducing true one-dimensional side-scrolling to the title, and slippery ice mechanics. There is a lot going on here. There are ice cubes to kick to knock down obstacles, snowball throwing snowmen to defeat, spiky ceilings and floors to avoid, and moving slippery platforms to cross. The difficulty in this game continues to be ridiculous, with precise platforming being required, but the gameplay diversity certainly continues too. Stage 5 sees new gameplay mechanics yet again introduced, where the Battletoads must surf through a level similar to the sewer surfing stages seen in the Turtles games. Not long into this stage though, and the game reverts back to traditional beat-em-up action as players take on many familiar foes with some new enemies mixed in too, before surfing continues in more action similar to the flying bike stage. Knarth's Lair is a bizarre stage that sees the Toads riding a giant snake in an upward motion. The difficult stage involves avoiding obstacles and clinging to the snake as it descends towards the top of the level. Precise platforming is required as usual. Stage 7 returns to traditional beat-em-up action, however there is some platforming amongst the stage too. But the meat and potatoes of this stage mixes up gameplay once more, presenting a long section which can only be described as the equivalent to a space shoot-em-up where you cannot shoot. Basically, your Toad or Toads ride a small plane which can be flown all over the screen as players avoid countless obstacles hurtling towards them. Difficult stuff as usual. Stage 8 sees players climbing a mechanical tower, jumping from platform to platform, whilst avoiding obstacles, robotic enemies and other threats. There are springs located around the stage too, making the ascent a little bit more comfortable. This is a fairly short stage, which sees players face off against a boss with a large gun in the closing moments. Stage 9 features the Toads making their way through a network of pipes, in a stage that amazingly continues to introduce new play mechanics this late in the game. There are propellers the Toads can use to lower themselves through the stage, and there are mechanical cogs to run away from until they are no longer chasing players. Amusingly, this is the first stage in the game to include sections in which the Toads use their swimming skills, which is kind of amusing for a game where you play as amphibious creatures. There are parts of this stage which are very cheeky though, as unless you know what you're doing, there will be certain deaths, as the level certainly features a lot of off-screen bullcrap which can kill the player. Difficulty in a game is fair enough, but I think this takes it a bit too far at times. The next level is one that features the player trying to get to the bottom of a stage as quickly as possible, defusing bombs along the way to ensure the Toads do not reach an unfortunate demise. In this fast-paced and frenetic stage, the music composed by David Wise is absolutely perfect for the game's action, as it just really ramps up the sense of urgency for players' experience in this part of the game. There is a boss at the end, but the challenge is nothing compared to many other parts of the title. On the next stage, new play mechanics and trippiness continue to be introduced as players ride an electric unicycle-like vehicle up walls and along floors and ceilings, avoiding what appears to be a black hole or void chasing the player. The diversity this game brings is insane really, especially for a simple NES game. Eventually at the end of the stage, players fight the void, which by this point reminds me more of a stickless lollipop rather than anything actually threatening. Stage 12, known as the Revolution, sees the Toads ascending a tower. The graphics and gameplay on this level appear to be inspired by the classic microcomputer game known as Nebulous, which is a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. But not that surprising I suppose when you consider that Battletoads is a British game. The stage delivers everything you would expect by this point, tons of precise platforming that requires a bloody lot of skill. Atop the tower, players finally face off with the Dark Queen, who, no surprise like every female villain in a beat 'em up game, is basically a dominatrix who gives her services away for free. A classic beat 'em up trope, ladies and gentlemen. Provided she is stopped from trampling the player, she retreats, returning Pimple and Princess Angelica back to the Toads, with the Dark Queen returning to what the game refers to as the shadowy margins of the galaxy. The game finally draws to a close here. In terms of this game's critical reception, Nintendo Power awarded this title first place in the categories Graphics and Sound, Theme and Fun, Best Play Controls and Best Multiplayer. It was also named Nintendo Power's Game for the NES in 1991. In general, back in the day, Battletoads received mostly praise from critics upon release. CVG thought the graphics were the best aspect of the game, heralding them as packed with colour, smooth scrolling and humorous animation. CVG also praised the overall gameplay, stating that while it borrowed style and ideas from other games, the combination of various styles works a treat and proved challenging. Quebec Gamer praised the graphics, stating them to be among the most graphically advanced NES games, in particular the animation. These days, if Battletoads for the NES is criticised at all, it tends to be for the game's extreme level of difficulty. The game has appeared countless times on hardest games ever made lists, and is often referred to as one of the hardest games ever made, which is made harder by the fact that players can accidentally kill one another in cooperative play. Despite its difficulty, the game was hugely popular, and the NES game is well remembered today for its characters, animation and most importantly, its diverse gameplay mechanics, which overall contribute to Battletoads being far more than just a regular beat 'em up, or a simplistic Turtles arcade ripoff. The game ended up being a different beast entirely, and would end up being Rare's greatest success on the NES. For this reason, the game would end up being ported to several other systems, and multiple other games would be created over the years featuring this successful license. Another game titled Battletoads, developed by Rare, would also see release in 1991 for Nintendo hardware, with this second game being developed for the Game Boy, featuring the same name but completely different stages. Being a different game entirely, I shall not discuss this game any further today, but if there is enough demand for it, I guess I'll feature it in a handheld around the world episode down the line. Next in 1992, Battletoads would arrive on the Amiga home computer format. Being a 16-bit system, the Amiga version of the game features improved visuals over its NES counterpart, and the Amiga sound chip makes the music in the game certainly sound leagues better than its NES brother too. Still though, I don't feel as much love was put into this version, probably due to the fact that the Amiga gaming market was not even close to the size of its NES counterpart, and the game seems to lack sound effects and many of the stages have been altered or changed completely. Still though, it's interesting to see this Mindscape published version of the game. Battletoads would also see release on the Amiga CD32 home console 2 years later in 1994. 1993 would see the game released on Sega consoles. The Mega Drive version of this game is far more impressive than its Amiga equivalent in my opinion, delivering a much stronger 16-bit experience. Due to Battletoads' extreme difficulty, the game even had its difficulty level toned down, as did the Famicom version of the game actually, which came out after the game saw release on the NES in the West. With regards to this Mega Drive version though, some of the more demanding levels were modified or changed about altogether, despite being supported by more powerful hardware. The game lacks much of the opening sequence of the game and cuts sections of the ending too. More layers of parallax scrolling have been added to the backgrounds though, to help give this version of the game further 16-bit polish. The Game Gear port that would also arrive in 1993 has 3 stages completely missing from the game, and the remaining levels were redesigned to take the Game Gear's tiny screen into account. It is of note that collision detection is reportedly not as accurate in this version either, hilariously making the game even more difficult at times. Vehicle levels on the other hand are reportedly easier due to it being possible to take more than one hit before losing a life in this version of the game. So swings and roundabouts I suppose. Something else worth mentioning is that Rare would release a completely separate game in the arcades, simply known as Battletoads in 1994. But this is a different game completely, so would require a further deep dive to explore. Let me know in the comments if you are interested in me covering this one too. Overall though, in terms of the original game, in my opinion the title's varied gameplay elements were fairly well executed, as a result of the many different games Rare had worked on over the years. In some ways, Battletoads was all of this coming together into one game. The title's uniqueness and effort put forward by Rare, paired with Battletoads' likeness to Turtles, made the game a smash hit, and the game would even receive its own short-lived animated TV show, just like the Turtles. The game would receive multiple sequels, spin-offs, and will even finally receive a new entry in the series next week. Battletoads' biggest legacy though, which I feel is not touched on enough, is how important Battletoads was when it came to gaming's future. Once Rare had found success with this franchise, they streamlined what they did. Using the money that Battletoads had made for the company, Rare would use those profits to buy their expensive Silicon Graphics workstations and focus all of their efforts into just a couple of games a year. Games like Killer Instinct and Donkey Kong Country were now possible due to Rare becoming the most technologically advanced developer in the UK. The company were now situated high up in the international market, which means we would only end up receiving games like GoldenEye and Banjo-Kazooie due to all the money a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles ripoff made. When it comes to Battletoads, we all have a lot to be thankful for. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the fantastic story of the first Battletoads game. Let me know in the comment section down below which other games you would like me to cover in the future, and be sure to subscribe for multiple videos like this a week. If you're a first time viewer today, make sure you do that. These videos are possible due to the support backers provide this channel with over on Patreon. Your appreciation of my work allows me to produce content on here full time, meaning that I will always try my utmost to entertain you all. You can get all of my content early and more, starting as little as just $1 a month. Every little helps in ensuring this channel's future. Yeah. Special shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Heyo Paula Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, BXL Gotham, Normal Guy, Rowan Dinch, Evan Balder, Philip Mamph, Cambo Rambo 82, Aswell Rarakai, Keith Ferguson, Dropkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, Sponge Matt B, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Aaron McNamara, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Barbara Kitty, Ron Studd, Uti McBoob, Langston Miller, Noob, Casey Wright, Zai, Brian Barry, Chris Margarine, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Flaming Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Marcus Soto, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yo, Hans Christian, Tamil Samway, Dan Van Dam, Adam Castin, Gregory Sarajiewicz, Rick 67, Louis Viant, John Bates, David Bell, Angry Little SOB, Mike Bruno, Chris Fisk, Ivan M, Paul Elliott, Me Machine Dean, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroverse.com, Sin Spaces, and Andrew Byzanski. Thank you so much for all of your support. Yeah. Cheerio.